Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here. Welcome to another episode of HourTime Experiments. This is our ongoing beta of the audio and visual version of HourTime. I'm here once again with aBlogtoWatch senior editor David Breton. How you doing?
That's right. Hey everyone, doing great. One thing notwithstanding, I can't see your screen just yet. You have not shared it with me.
Oh, that's called a technical error.
Yes.
And you should be good.
Yes, it's happening.
If David doesn't see my screen,
That's
then
a problem.
David sees nothing. He's basically he's blind.
My life is for that reason.
We got a couple of pretty heavy topics to discuss today. This is big deal stuff.
Oh yeah, big time.
So I wrote an article a couple of days ago. We have not published it yet, so we're going to be giving everyone kind of a preview. I don't actually know when we're going to publish this episode of the show, but chances are that it will be prior to when we actually publish the article. So we'll be talking about it, and you can read about it. It's a long article. What is it, David? Like 7,000 words?
It's 7,500 words. It's crazy. Like, to give you an idea, in a magazine with images, that would be like over 30 pages.
I basically wrote a magazine. In sort of just like one stream of consciousness, I wrote a magazine. But it took, years of, I'll call it research and discovery to come up with some of the conclusions I do. And the topic, again, is what's going on with the watch industry in terms of the problems it's having. The watch industry sometimes seems to be the last one to realize there's an issue. And then when it happens, they don't realize it. And no one has really taken an active role in trying to ameliorate a lot of the damaging business trends, I'll call it that, in the watch industry. I remember I participated in a study several months ago with a company called Blue Shift, which is one of these professional companies that do these, industry research reports. And I think we talked about it on a previous episode. But, their question was, is the problems with the watch industry systemic? Meaning, does it something to do with the way the industry is organized and the way it operates? Or is it have to do with economic trends? Like, is there a recession, which is the problem, or something like that? Meaning that if economic things strengthened or got better, then we would, the watch industry would bounce back a little bit. And so I helped them on the study. Of course, there was a lot of, it was all this data and there's a lot of things they did. And it was just, it basically came to the conclusion, no, it's not, it's not market related. It is a little bit market related, but a lot of it has to do with systemic problems with the industry itself. And so I've asked myself, how did this happen? What caused all this? Because people don't inherently want to sort of, destroy their own watch industry. And again, it sounds quite negative, but it's really true that sometimes from our perspective, and David, tell me if you agree, the watch industry seems intent on destroying itself. They do things that just don't make sense. You feel that way a lot, right?
Yeah, from sort of an outsider's perspective, it does seem that way. Yes, it's true. I mean, we have an inside perspective, but if you're just looking at it based on the news and what's happening and the trends, what's happening inside the watch industry, you would feel inclined to say that, yeah, that's what they are doing sometimes.
I've said this before, several times, and I'll say it again. You and I, and I'm just going to speak for you. You can correct me if I'm wrong. We work in the watch industry not because of, I'll say the people and so much in the way it works and the companies, but there's a select amount of talent and the products that we like. So there's some really creative, talented, smart people there that make it worth it, and there's some really great products that make it worth it. But overall, it's kind of a headache. It's not a particularly modern industry, and I think that a lot of people are pushed out of the industry. There's a talent flight right now, especially among the big groups. There's the most talented people just seem to go away, and that's a problem. So when you read this article that I wrote, and what was it obvious? Were you like, okay, that makes sense, like I already knew that, or was there something new in it that you learned?
Well, what I would say is that this is such a long stream of thought and feedback on what's been happening that I think overall, as you come to a conclusion where you feel like, yeah, I sort of knew that this was happening, but you really do have to read it all to make the picture, just come together. So So in details, there were new things, and overall, for me, the biggest novelty here was to realize that how all these little things resulted in the situation that we are seeing right now.
So let's just sort of like break it down. I'm not going to tell everyone everything. I'm just going to go through pieces of sort of what it is we're talking about. Again, I realize that speaking about it, we sound kind of vague and ambiguous. That's because it's a complicated topic. So here is on the screen, you can see the sort of preview of the article, and it's called "How the Push for In-House Movements Ruined the Modern Luxury Watch Industry." Well, what does that mean? Well, my theory is that the effort by many brands to produce their own movements in-house in the modern era caused a series of events to take place which ballooned costs. Ballooned costs required ballooning profits, also required investors to cover a lot of these costs in the short term. Investors and vis-a-vis buyers expect even higher profits. Therefore, the industry was pressured into getting a lot more money than it could have done sustainably, which resulted in, I'll just basically say, a whole series of events that occurred that made short-term profit possible, but long-term profit impossible. In other words, that caused bubbles, which led to the situation we have today, which is there's too many watches and watches are priced too high. And while there may have been other people that have put all these pieces together, I haven't heard it myself. So I'm not trying to say that I've discovered something here. I'm just saying that I've never had the conversation with anyone. And so I think it's a really important discussion to have. And then I think what's really important is, okay, now that we know this, what do we do about it? And there are things that can be done, but let's just sort of go back a little bit and talk about the bigger picture. What year was it, David, that ETA first announced that they wanted to stop supplying movements to brands?
Well, when I was doing research for the article that I wrote on the history of ETA, what I found was that it was said that Mr. Hayek Sr. Mentioned his plan, these plans as early as the late 90s. Officially, the first push in this direction from ETA happened, if I remember correctly, in the early 2000s. But then the Swiss government and federal agencies, all that kind of stuff, pushed it back by years and years and years because ETA was in a monopoly position, and it's not like you're a monopoly and you can just stop supplying to others, because that would just kill the industry and kill everyone else off. And that's why you have these government agencies who told them, hey, you cannot do this so fast. So to answer your question, it was if we were being conservative and looking at official things, it's early 2000s.
Yeah, so how it started, and again, there's an article that David wrote, a great one, in 2013 on the history of ETA, which was not easy to do. I know how much you suffered in that. Yes. But ETA, and again, we're just trying to give a little bit of backstory here for people that don't know. ETA is a company that started a long time ago. It was absorbed when the Swatch Group was created in the 80s. And ETA is a company that made what they called movement blanks, which was basically just watch movements. There's no watches that say ETA on there. Well, there are some training watches and student watches that say ETA on there, but you can't buy an ETA watch. ETA is not a watch brand. ETA produces movements, and they produce a lot of very famous movements, such as the 2824 and the 7750, and so forth. So ETA doesn't make the most complicated movements out there, but they make a lot of the movements that were in a lot of the watches. And I'll say circa the year 2000, if you bought a watch, a Swiss mechanical watch with a price under $5,000, and that was a lot of watches, chances are it had a movement that was produced by ETA. Would you say that's correct, David?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so again, you had different brands, different designs and things like that, but they were using a lot of the same movement that no one really seemed to be complaining. If you were a watch brand, essentially what you need to do is become kind of like a creative agency. You produced a design, and then you had a series of suppliers that produced the necessary parts. Most of the suppliers were in Switzerland. And then you would buy a movement. Chances are you'd buy it from ETA. Sometimes you'd modify it, sometimes you wouldn't. You put it in your watch and you'd sell your watch. And that allowed you to have a relatively low, what I call manufacturing overhead, right? Because you didn't have machinery, you didn't have factory workers, you didn't have a lot of R&D costs, because there were suppliers, there was existing companies out there that did all this stuff. Right. And then ETA, for a lot of reasons, basically said, you know what, we don't want to keep selling all these movements to these companies. They're essentially competitors of our brands, right? So the Swatch Group owns a bunch of brands that use ETA movements. There's Hamilton, and Tissot, and Longines, and Certina, and others.
And a whole bunch of others,
yeah, there's a few other brands that use ETA movements. And it wasn't that ETA wanted to stop supplying movements to every single company. It just said, we want to have a little bit more options, because under the terms of the Swiss government, they kind of had to sell watches to a lot of people. And they say, you know, Swiss made, whatever that means, the term Swiss made is important. And there's brands out there that are denigrating the Swiss made name. And there's probably some truth to that. So ETA basically said, Swatch Group said, we don't want to have to sell watches to who we don't want to sell to. And some of those reasons were they were trying to hurt competition. Other times they were trying to, in their mind, protect what a Swiss watch is. And I genuinely believe that there was a degree of that. But it seemed odd because I wasn't really sure today, and I'm not really sure I don't think I was sure for a long time what exactly ETA was thinking in the process, because if you stop supplying movements to all these brands, either they go under, they produce their own movements, or they buy movements from someone else. And there really weren't other options. There was no other Swiss ETA. They had to buy movements from different countries like Japan or China or things like that. That happened almost negligibly. That didn't really happen at all. It wasn't like brands that had Swiss movements all of a sudden had, Japanese movements. That didn't really happen. There's one instance we won't talk about that kind of happened, but that's a different story. That's frequently misunderstood, actually. But so what ETA did is basically said to everyone, well, if you can't have our movements, just make your own. Just invest. Many of you guys used to make it before, and there's all this information out there. So why don't you just go ahead and try to make it yourself? And so, what that actually ended up doing was forcing a lot of companies to make a really weird decision. Sorry, we had an internet outage, so we're going to start back up from where we left off. I was basically saying that when ETA decided to stop providing movements to a lot of companies, basically stop selling movements to them, the brands had three options, and that was to go out of business, produce their own movements, or buy movements from elsewhere. Buying movements from elsewhere really wasn't an option unless you no longer wanted to have a Swiss-made watch. And I think part of what Swatch Group was trying to do was say, we want to own the market at a certain price point, a certain lower price point of Swiss-made watches. Of course, there was other companies that produced Swiss-made watches at higher price points, but I think what Swatch Group wanted to do was say, under a certain threshold level, we want to own the Swiss-made name. And there was wisdom to that, in the sense that was a likely outcome of what was going to happen. I don't think that they would have been able to foresee what actually happened, and that was the fact that, very few brands went and bought movements from other countries. And it wasn't as though every single brand just went ahead and just sort of said, we give up. So a lot of brands sort of what I call is the ETA challenge, and that was to make their own movements. Now, to make your own movements, you need to become a factory. Now, a lot of these brands used to be factories. They used to make movements, and then after the quartz crisis, they realized we don't really need to do that anymore. There's people like ETA. Now, it's true that if a bunch of companies are making their own movements, what are you going to get? You're going to get more differentiation. You're going to get more options. You're going to get more distinctiveness. But at the end of the day, there's only so many things you can do in a relatively mass-produced movement in terms of complexity. So I think one of the issues that ended up happening is there just really aren't a lot of value propositions for consumers in these different movements, right? Many of them essentially do the same thing, and the slight performance differences here or there don't really matter, because if you're really interested in performance, well, then you're not going to get a mechanical watch anyways. You're probably going to get some type of a electronic instrument. So Etta basically said to everyone, invest in making your own movements. A lot of people did. Now, to do this, they needed a lot of money. Where did they get the money? Well, they went to banks. They went to investors. They had buyers. So you had big groups, various types of groups, luxury groups, like LVMH, for example, going and buying brands. Because the idea was that if you needed to have let's say a 10-year outlook, where you have to invest in a factory, you have to build a building, you have to hire people, you have to do R&D, you have to buy all kinds of machinery, you have to learn things. It's going to take a long time to absorb those costs before you're even breaking even. And many companies were just not set up to do that, and I completely understand why. So when you get an investor or you have a buyer, one of the sort of logical outcomes of that is needs to be generated, right? So if you're a $10 million a year company and someone buys you, well, they're probably not going to be happy with just $10 million a year, right? If let's say they have to buy you for $30 or $40 million, they're going to want to boost you up, right? They're buying the company for some type of asset, not as like some type of residual annuity. They're going to want to increase the profits and things like that, and that's very commonly what happened. Also, the cost of doing business increased, right? So if you're a $10 million a year company, and you now have to make your own movements, you now have to make a lot more money just to cover your expenses in terms of the new machines, the new personnel, all kinds of things like that. So all of a sudden, even if there isn't someone out there basically saying you need to make more money, you might need to make $10 million more dollars a year. You might have to make $20 or $30 million a year just to sort of be in the same position as you were before. Now, we're talking about the luxury watch industry. When I say luxury, I don't just mean nice stuff. What I really mean is stuff you don't need. So it's not like a commodity in the sense where if you build a better watch, more people are going to get it. Yes, that's true to a degree, but that's really sort of collectors and enthusiasts. So now, with all these brands producing their own movements and having these inflated costs and new demanding shareholders and owners, they have to make more money. And I think right now we need to stop for a second, because we have to think about what did this sort of create in terms of a cultural shift. David, how many times have you heard people say people are in the watch industry are just greedy? How many times have you heard that?
Yeah, that happens all the time, especially when something comes out at a price that is unexpectedly high, because people don't know these things that you just discussed. And they will just, everyone's looking for a reason, and the reason they most of them find is just pure greed. So yeah, we've heard it a lot.
There is greed. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist. There's a lot of people out there that don't fundamentally respect the educated consumer. They're trying to charge too much money for something. But the larger groups are a little smarter than that, right? They know. They know how the consumers think. They more or less understand, what the consumer will bear. But they had to increase costs. Why? Because of the fact that they now had their own increased costs to deal with. So that is one of the reasons that costs went so high. But in addition to costs going high in terms of the prices, you also had companies making a lot more units than could be sold, right? Because there's two ways of increasing revenue. One, you charge more money for the same product, but there's only a limit that you can do that. Two, you produce more units. But the watch industry doesn't sell direct to the consumer most of the time. They sell what they call into the market, which is wholesale, right? So if they sell, let's just say 100,000 watches to retailers, they're making their full margin. They're making all the money that they anticipated making. The retailers then have the responsibility of selling those 100,000 watches to the end consumer. But when those watches are sold via wholesale, the watch brand is just kind of happy. They just sort of wipe their hands of it and said, let's focus on the next round of production. And so that happened for a few years in a row, where the watch industry was making a lot of watches, and what happened was they weren't able to sell all those watches into the market. So what does that mean? That means that over a period of, I'll say, a decade or so, we had a situation that was, depending on where you were and depending on the type of brand, slower or faster, more watches entering the market than could be sold to consumers. Now, David, you tell me, what happened when there was more watches in the market that could be sold to final consumers through authorized retailers?
Well, most of the time, well, more often than not, they ended up in the gray market.
They ended up the gray market. What functionally, what does that mean for the watch industry?
Well, that means heavy discounting and just prices dropping like crazy on the market itself.
Right. So there was more watches that could be sold. Prices were being discounted because no one wanted to buy anything, and that's simple economics. If people can't buy something, you just got to keep reducing the price. And that also destroyed what I call brand equity. That means that a lot of brands, I'll call it the positive association a lot of people had with them started to erode, because even if they like their watches, all they would do is see the watches discounted. So people don't take the brand's pricing as seriously anymore, which clearly makes sense given the situation. So you had a situation where the consumer was essentially trained not to spend full retail on something because of the robustness of the gray market. Now, the internet had a big part to do with the gray market getting as big as it is. And I truly, truly believe that sort of at the beginning of all this, if the watch industry understood that the effect that the internet would have, they probably would have halted a lot of this stuff. But would you agree with me that the watch industry just completely did not understand the effect that internet would have on its business?
Yeah, I think it came totally unexpected to them. Absolutely. Unfortunately, I mean, this is not something that makes me happy. It's just the fact that all the things that we see indicate that it was largely unexpected.
So going back to sort of the discussion here, and again, there's a lot more elements here that I tried to sort of elaborate on in the article, but just to recap, ETA made the decision to stop supplying ready-made movements to many companies. Those companies responded by having to produce their own movements, which increased the cost of doing business tremendously. In order to support those higher costs, the companies needed to increase the retail price of their watches and the production volume. They thought that they could charge more money because now they're offering a new fancy movement. But it wasn't as though they were charging a small increase, they were charging a large increase, and functionally the value wasn't necessarily there to the consumer. We like in-house movements. There's a lot of reasons that we like in-house movements, but the question is, are they necessary? Do we need as many of them? And what is the price premium we're willing to pay? So we had all these watches being produced that they were not selling enough, which created overproduction, meaning too many unsold watches in the market, and prices higher than the market could bear, which has caused a lot of the sort of bubbles that occur now. And that is also why a lot of these companies went to what they call emerging markets like China, Brazil, Russia, India. The idea was that these developing markets that have pockets of wealth would be great places to sell all these extra watches that they needed to produce in order to hopefully make up for the higher costs. And that's one of the reasons there was such a big push into China, because China culture seemed to have an appetite for them, but then the Swiss watch industry went kind of nuts. And so because of that, that's why you had this sort of bubble effect, and why in the watch industry there's been several bubbles over the last 15 years. Wouldn't you agree, David?
Yes, absolutely. And one thing I wanted to mention is that this push towards in-house movements and all this investment that the brands were receiving and seeing was largely fueled by a huge bubble that we saw in the industry over the last, exactly 15 years. Yep.
So that's sort of my theory. There's, little pieces here and there that I probably could know a little bit more about, but I'm hoping that the community will come and help sort of fill in some of the gaps. But I think the point we are now is, now that we understand this, what do we do about it? Just sort of, we talked about this a little bit, but what would you suggest, David, to the industry? If you could give them some advice, what do they do now that they found themselves in this situation?
Well, the funny thing is, obviously reduce prices, but anyone can say that. But now that we understand the problem in a little bit greater detail, you cannot just say reduce prices until stuff sells, because, like you said, they have certain investments that they have to create the return on. So that's a problem. All in all, just somehow just make things a little bit more reasonable. Reduce the number of in-house movements, which is just outrageous at this point. And yes, some brands and even more brands in some collections have to stop producing in-house movements, because it just makes no sense. I mean, the premium that is demanded for these things is just outrageous. And I feel that people would like to buy nice watches, they would like to buy nice movements, but there need not be so many movements. And of course here we're speaking a little bit against ourselves, because we really like to see new stuff. But sometimes, especially at this point when it hurts the industry so much, these things have to be done a little in a more reasonable scale.
Okay,
sure.
So
just rationalize.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think there needs to be less in-house made movements. I don't think that many of the new in-house movements that come out, I look at it and I think to myself, that's really nice, but do I care? Does it offer me any type of functionality whatsoever above and beyond an ETA? And oftentimes, wouldn't you agree the answer is no?
Yeah, I agree totally. Especially, things have to come together in a way that's so rare, where the design is good, the price is good, the movement is good, the functionality is there. There's just no need to be like throwing so many things at a wall and see what sticks, because that just creates more investment, more cost. And it's crazy where we are now. And actually, so just let me add that when you guys are reading through the articles, just pay attention to the images, because they're not random images. So a lot of the times they go really well with the context and what is being said. point well made here. So yeah, of course the images are not like randomly selected. They prove a point.
Selected with love and care.
Exactly, yes. Great care, and help you read between the lines a little bit more.
I had some pretty crazy ideas on how to fix all this. One of them is take a lot of these people that listen, the brands don't want to fire people. I understand that nobody wants to be fired or have to fire people, but they have all this manufacturing base. What I think needs to happen is there needs to be a couple versions of ETA. If ETA wants to sell only to whoever ETA wants to sell to, that's fine. But why, rather than have this incredible level of redundancy among the brands of movement manufacturing, why not just have 4 or 5 or 6 companies that produce movements that can sell to each other? Sellita is a good example, but the problem with Sellita is Sellita has had challenges, but Sellita still essentially just sells clones of ETA movements. They haven't really done anything unique. And I'm not really sure why that is, to be honest. I think that there's an opportunity there to fundamentally, offer something a little bit new. I'm sure there's good reasons for it, but that's something that I see as a whole. Also, and this is a little bit crazy, but I've had this idea actually a long time ago, as many as, I don't know, almost 10 years ago now. But why does the watch industry not use some of its excess production capacity to produce precision components for other industries that need it, like medical devices, like robotics, like aerospace? There's a lot of companies that need small precision parts that are difficult to make, that require an enormous amount of low tolerances, and the watch industry is perfectly suited to do that. I don't see why they can't shift some part of their production capacity to other things. And that also makes things more relevant. If you buy watches from a company whose movements come from a factory that also make robotics parts, doesn't that make it kind of more cool and temporally relevant to today's world? What do you think?
I think it does, but I can hear the snobs already saying, "Oh, it's not a real manufacturer. They make." I think a lot of these purism and snobbery is killing a lot of good things, and I would not be surprised to hear brands just simply be afraid to make this kind of move, because this would damage our image and all that kind of nonsense, which it wouldn't, because for one it would be cool, at least for you and me, I think it would be cool. But yeah, I think they are reasonably afraid of people looking at the brand in a different way. If they start making stuff for completely different industries, I guess that can happen.
Look, we've spent about a half hour on this topic, maybe even more. I really do this because I want people to talk about this more. I don't have all the solutions. I'm just one person. But I think it's very important to discuss this, because at the end of the day, if people don't talk about this, there's never going to be a solution to it. And it takes a community, it takes the industry together. It's going to take a little bit of bravery to figure out how to handle this, because pretty much everyone agrees there's more watches being produced than people want to buy, and prices are higher than most consumers want to spend. And I think the proof of that is that the same person who was buying a nice mechanical tool watch in the 1990s has very little they can afford for the same prices they were spending. In the 1990s, a good tool watch cost you between $2,000 and $3,000, and you got a lot of watch. Today, how much is that same watch? Double, triple, quadruple the price?
5, 6, 7,000?
At least. Okay, maybe it has movement. Maybe the same movement. Maybe an in-house movement, but it doesn't do anymore. It just doesn't really do anymore. At least not 2, 3, 4 times as much.
Yeah. With an in-house movement, I wouldn't say it's just 5, 6,000. With an in-house movement, it all of a sudden becomes 8, 9, 10. What used to be 2, 3. I mean, there are so many examples. It's crazy. If the same movement, the same watch, maybe a little bit different packaging or something like that, but the product itself is 99.99% unchanged, then it went from 2,500 to at least 5, 6,000 in 15, 20 years.
As a consumer, what people need to be doing is really shifting their focus on the personal value that they have for in-house movements. I know in-house movements are awesome. I'm guilty myself of liking them as well a lot. But I think that if you get an in-house movement, get an in-house movement because it does something that a standard ETA or other supplied movement doesn't. It needs to look different. It needs to function differently. It has to be more complicated. Like, buy in-house movements that have a reason for being in-house. If it doesn't have a reason for being in-house, the premium that you're paying on it isn't worth it. Doesn't make sense. There are very real reasons why they cost more. It's not just greed. And, again, there is greed out there, but it's not just greed. It has to do with these artificially high costs. Well, they're not artificially. They're not necessary in the sense that they're redundant. Yes. They're redundantly high costs. And so I think that's just something for people to think about. Speaking of manufacturers, let's change topics. I published an article that I wrote after going to Casio in Japan, seeing where they make their higher-end G-Shocks and other models there. Man, that was awesome. Here's the thing. It's like you go to these manufacturers in Switzerland, and these watches with in-house movements cost, I don't know, $7,000 and upwards. Not all the time, but, up and up and up and up. And then you go to Japan, and you're like, the most awesome Casio watch today, aside from a few limited editions, is probably like $2,000 or $3,000. Yes, they have They have limited editions that go higher, over $6,000, but those have special artistic reasons. The Oceanus collection, Oceanus, is probably the highest grade, non-limited edition watch that Casio produces. Of course, those are a little bit less popular globally than the G-Shock models, but like your highest end G-Shock is, I don't know, $1,200, $1,300, and then you have the the MRG and MTG. They can go up to about $3,000, but about $3,000 or so is about the limit. And man, do you get a crazy watch? And I think what really sort of like struck me visiting Casio in Japan, where they produce these watches, is how this is among the rare watches which are still I'll call it technologically relevant today, because every time I go to like Europe and I see a watch movement manufacturer, even if the machinery they're using is relevant, the product itself is still just a retro beauty item. It's fun, it's cool, I love it, but it's not like, you know, active professionals out there are waiting for the newest like Cartier watch. No, you know, they're not. You know, these are watches that rescue workers, soldiers, law enforcement, all kinds of people who have crazy active lifestyles absolutely rely on. And that means something today, right? Because this is still something which makes sense. There's a picture I'm looking at right here, and they were demonstrating, and this is a slightly further back shot of the top one here. They're basically tasing the watch. This is the Progress. This is the dive watch. I have no idea when this watch would actually be subjected to electric shock, but they're actually tasing the watch at a relatively high voltage. Now, I don't know if you've ever tased a piece of electronics. I used to do it stupidly. I was like, what if I tased my television remote control? Well, that just destroyed the television remote control. I have done that. I learned my lesson.
Surprise.
I was a kid. What do you want from me? But that destroys it. That fries the circuits. So this is, you know, listen, most of these higher end G-Shocks are mostly metal. It's not like they're tasing plastic, right? That little spark would not connect if it was just, you know, so, you know, the watch is fine. You know, the watch is totally fine. It didn't harm it whatsoever. Can you think of any, you know, like, I can't think of, you know, I'm trying to think of equivalency in Swiss watches. Okay, so for example, you know, a lot of these watches are rated to fall from like hip height to the ground on a hard surface and supposed to survive. I mean, like
wooden floor.
A wooden floor. Okay, that doesn't. First of all, that still breaks them half the time, anyways. And that is not what I would say is like sort of like the you know the illustration of durability. It's like a 3-foot maximum drop. Again, super awesome that the mechanical watches survive that, but like, you know. There's okay, right here, this picture. This is a concrete block, and what this watch actually just fell, and there's a machine that literally like thrusts it down. And this machine was sitting next to another machine that was sort of an artificial drop test machine. And awesome. Casio said, well, we had to build the second machine because we started making the watches so durable, the first machine couldn't break any of them. And I said, okay, well, this machine, has this been able to break all the watches so far? And they look at each other like, eventually. I'm like, what's eventually? They're like, we don't want to admit how long we've been dropping some of these watches. And so I said, okay, so if you start making watches that survive this machine, what are you going to do? And they're like, build a stronger machine. Right? And
that's so cool.
Yeah, but that's a true story about these types of watches. Now, when in the 80s, when Mr. eBay was testing the G-Shock, his measure of durability wasn't dropping it on the floor. His measure of durability was dropping it out of a window a few stories high.
Literally throwing it out the window.
Yes, and he was determined, to make sure that it survived, falling out of a window a bunch of times. And there's no mechanical watches that can do that. And again, yes, but it's not just because it's quartz. There's a lot of quartz watches that would totally break. It's not just about that. It's a culture that Casio began of not just designing and engineering durability, but the consumer expectation of durability. When you have a quartz watch, you expect it to like put up with anything, and most don't. But because of the proliferation of G-Shock, my theory is that they have sort of trained consumers that any digital watch is supposed to put up with a lot of abuse. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think we have to clarify that we are, at least I wouldn't try to, imply that, these things should be expected from mechanical watches, because they just simply can't be expected. But that does not take anything away from how amazing the durability of these watches, actually is, because Like you said, a lot of quartz watches just shatter and break, and just fail to function properly if you drop them from like a meter high or something like that.
This
Here, some of the G-Shocks actually, also have hands, so it's not, the hands could come off or get like, out of alignment or anything like that. But here, with the G-Shocks, that never happens, and that level of durability, I find to be like genuinely amazing.
I mean, look at this machine right here. Again, this is a machine that they built. And this is one of the dive watches of Frogman. So this machine, it's I did a little video of this on Instagram actually. This machine just basically pushes the pushers in water again and again and again and again and again, just to see what happens. So it's not just testing water resistance; it's just testing to make sure that you can push the buttons underwater countless times and that the watch works fine.
Now that actually is something I would love to see in more mechanical watches, because here here there has to be like some sort of a mechanical connection between the pusher and the motherboard or whatever it is in the watch, and this is just a question of how the seals are constructed and how the buttons are constructed. So a few mechanical watches can do this, yes, but a lot of the times you get these annoying screw down pushers that are annoying to use, and it's just crazy. I think this should be a thing in more mechanical watches.
The only other company that I've seen does anything even remotely similar is Rolex, and they do things where they'll take their bracelets, for example, and they'll try to artificially age them on robots to see when the bracelet will break. Sometimes they never break, but I mean, listen, it's kind of a rule. In the world of machines, that everything will break eventually. It just depends on the stress and how long. Yep. So sometimes it'll take so long that we'll all be long dead. But theoretically, everything like this machine right here, if it pushed these pushers enough times, something bad would happen. But the idea is that it would take so long that no one would even think that was bad, right? Like, oh, it would happen in 1,000 years. I'm not saying it would take 1,000 years, but that's the notion, right? But this level of design and engineering is inherent in the product, and I think it's something that people kind of know. But it was really cool to see it happening hands-on. And again, this is actually one of the more expensive G-Shocks. I think this one retails for about $1,200 or so. But you're getting an insane amount of watch for $1,200 here. I mean, literally an insane amount of watch, and that's what Casio continues to do today. So this is what they call the PPL, the premium production line. This was part of it. And I mean, look at these guys. Look at how clean this room is. Look at how they're dressed. I really don't think that most people would assume that this is how G-Shock watches are assembled. Does this surprise you a little bit?
Surprise me? No. What surprises me is that I didn't see this more often in more manufacturers. That's what surprises me.
That's
it's so rare to see people dress like that. I mean, yeah, that's pretty crazy. And you would imagine that this is not necessary. I mean, for electronics, of course, at some level of production, but what you're seeing here when they're casing them or aligning the hands or stuff like that, I mean, this process happens all the time in every watch manufacturer, and you don't see this level of cleanliness, and this level of clothing and everything anywhere else, basically, or 99% of other places that I've been to.
So this picture right here was, if you just sort of skimming through the article, it's probably a little bit difficult to totally understand what you're seeing here, but this was part of the quality control section. These are the Oceanus watches, and Oceanus watches, as well as some of many of the higher end G-Shocks have analog hands, and those hands need to be set. But what's more important is the hands need to be properly aligned. So this is part of the machinery that basically not only measures the alignment, but also allows you to make sure that as the watch operates, the hands continue to be aligned properly, so they don't just place them in this way, they're actually operating the watch and seeing that the hands always line back up. Now, you know very well that there's a lot of quartz watches that you can buy where the seconds hand doesn't line up. How much does that piss you off?
A lot. I mean, we discussed this in the previous episode, and yeah, it's just crazy. I mean, it drives me nuts.
It drives
and
David
it's extremely, and it's super disappointing. I mean, you look at it and you're like, oh. And when I see that on the watch, I'm not interested anymore. I'm sorry. I mean, I guess that sounds bad, but I just don't care. I mean, why was that so freaking difficult to align that hand properly when you were doing that? Well, apparently it's really difficult, but it's something that you see all the time. You know, it's like it's something that looks back at you all the time when you're wearing the watch, and if it's out of alignment, you know, then it's just.
Well, you can
I just
buy a relatively inexpensive Casio that'll have a seconds hand that lines up absolutely perfectly, and it's because of equipment like this. It is a process that combines machinery and people. But these screens wouldn't. These screens aren't just here for like for show. These screens are here for an operator to look at and make sure that each single watch is getting this type of of testing and this type of tweaking, and that's great. You know, that's why I call this a lab, because it's not just like a factory. Like everything here is just super precision, super careful. And you gotta love that. You really have got to love it. Like here we go. Here's someone there. They're operating the equipment here. These lines on the screen are designed to help them measure things up. I mean, that's what they're doing. Here we go. This is the case. This is the resin case, and you can see here this mold that is designed for it. Like this stuff, you know, there's a master mold maker there that carves this out. This is the exact same type of thing that you would see in a much more expensive watch. This type of a mold would be part of a tool, and rather than it being, you know, made in plastic, it would be metal. You know, it'd be stamped or something like that. But you know, this is they use the plastic is not just to be inexpensive. You know, if it was, there's me with G-Shock, man. But if it was, you know, if metal was a better material, they would have used metal. But the plastic is much more functional. It absorbs shock. It's a lot lighter. What's funny is here's an MRG. This is one of the top of the line ones. This is actually a significant challenge because in the 90s when they started with the MRG collection, it was supposed to be like, you've graduated from G-Shock to Mr. G. This was, you know, like supposed to be like for the more successful, mature guy. They had to basically engineer the whole G-Shock sort of way of thinking that was based upon plastic back to metal. And that was a really big challenge. And the MTG is essentially like a metal-clad G-Shock, where the MRG, the structure underneath is totally different. And that's a very common question because there's over $1,000 price difference between the MTG and the MRG. But sometimes from a visual perspective, it's difficult to see. But the MRG is one of the most engineered timepieces on the planet when it comes from a durability perspective. And so this is analog. Yes, it has a quartz movement on the inside. This also has GPS and, of course, solar and all that stuff. But I would really like to see certain brands in Switzerland put this much level of focus into the case. Do you think that we're ever going to see that?
Well, I think eventually. I mean, they, you know, credit where it's due. They do put a lot. Some brands do put a lot of effort into experimenting with new materials like carbon fiber, different types of carbon fiber and composites and all that kind of stuff. And I think that we can all appreciate. But here, yeah, things go beyond that for sure, because it also involves internal construction of the piece very much.
It's really impressive. I've been kind of a G-Shock and Casio fan for, there's Mr. eBay, for, you know, as long as I can remember. But this really solidified it. And, you know, the amount of parts and pieces in each individual watch is just as much, if not more, than a mechanical watch. It costs a lot more. And again, it's you know, mechanical Swiss watches are beautiful and gorgeous, and they have all these things. But again, you know, I still continue to feel that a lot of them just simply don't have a lot in terms of the value proposition, because all the engineering that you could possibly want, you can get in a watch like this. Now, yes, Casio makes a higher volume of watches, and that is definitely true. But aside from that, I don't really know that there's too many reasons to, you know, to have to get a product that's a Swiss-made product, you know, thinking that there's more complexity in there, because there isn't more complexity. What's the point I'm trying to make? Say it in other words for me.
Well, yeah, I just get a G-Shock, everyone, seriously, and just wear it a lot, and just, you know, I think the point here is that you know, I think we all appreciate mechanical watches because we can appreciate the engineering. We think about the engineering and all the thought
And the beauty.
and everything that has gone into it. And the beauty, yes. But that's more subjective. But the engineering itself is more objective. And here, I think that here we can appreciate these watches for the exact same reason, because we look at them and we look at these images, for example, and we see all the love, all the attention, and all, you know, like decades of engineering that has gone into making them what they are today. And for this reason, I think that we can find them just as fascinating and in one way or another just as valuable as a mechanical timepiece.
Yeah, so
because you just gotta love the engineering. I mean, look at this stuff. I mean, all the thought and everything that has gone into it. It just boggles my mind.
I had a really good time here. I really enjoyed visiting Casio, and it was kind of cool because again, it was the first brand of watches that I started wearing, and I was always into it. I remember as a kid, you know, thinking to myself, why would you want something other than Casio? Because I was aware of other watches. I was like, the Casio, like, it's more durable, it does more stuff, and it looks cooler. Why would you want, like, a time-only analog watch? I remember thinking that as a kid. And again, I was comparing it to, like, you know, quartz analog watches, which today I'm still not that interested in. If I'm going to get an analog watch, well, then I don't really want a quartz one. I guess there's some exceptions for some cool stuff, but for the most part, I want, you know, if it's going to be quartz, I want something like G-Shock. There are analog ones, but they do a lot more than just tell the time. And if you go to mechanical watch, you know, it's beauty, it's status. I just think people need to be a little bit more honest with, you know, some of the reasons. Look at this. I mean, look at this. Look at the construction here. I mean, look again. It's not just look at all the layers.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
And a lot of this is for durability. All these rings, all these elements here. This is, you know, some of it's the movement, sure, but look at all these different pieces that go together for the durability. So these red sections here, this is called alpha gel, which is a shock absorbent material, which is actually kind of amazing. They had us throw an egg. A raw egg at alpha gel, like literally throw it at there, and it didn't break it. It didn't crack. I was actually kind of amazed.
So you mean like you had a larger like slab or piece of material from alpha gel?
Yeah, I mean it wasn't like the little piece out of the watch. There was like a doormat of alpha gel.
No,
that's what it was.
But that was not obvious, like how that would work.
Gel.
All right.
Yeah. So, anyways, I don't know.
That's kind of cool.
A lot of people like this article. I enjoyed that. I just want to talk about it a little bit because I wish other people could sort of, you know, replicate this experience. Just going there is cool. You know, I don't know if they do tours. I think they'll do it eventually because where's the picture here? If you see here, this is kind of a room where they have all these displays, and then there's some windows here that you look right into the production room. So they probably won't let most people in there. But this little tour room here, I think this needs to be like a mecca for any serious like G-Shock fan. Do we want to talk about anything uplifting other than Casio?
well, okay. We just brought the news of, you know, the impending doom of the mechanical watch industry and just hyped G-Shock to ever new heights. I think that's, you know, but hey, you know, credit where it's due. I mean, G-Shock and Casio deserves a lot of credit, and this must have been a super cool tour. So I think we're ending on a really high note here.
Breguet. I still like Breguet. You went to Breguet recently. How was that?
Yes, it was great. It was awesome. So what you see here, for example, you see this guilloche dial with this amazing texture on it. So what surprised me most there, and this was something that I wanted to know more about, is whether or not Breguet is making all of these guilloche parts, because you see this is like this texture is used on the majority of their watches, either on the cases or the dials or the automatic rotors, and they had this big room, like at least 30-40 guillochers inside with these machines working on the dials and all these other components, and that I found really impressive, that it's not outsourced or it's not they are not cutting corners there. They are actually making these components in house, and I found that to be really impressive. So you see here, for example, on the rotor, and also on the dial. I mean, this is something that you cannot speed up. There's no way of you doing this with getting this texture and pattern with like stamping or CNCing or anything like that.
The stamping, there are stamped ones. They look close, but they're not the same.
No. They will look super cheap in comparison. When you see them in real life, there's no way you can get any.
You can't get the sharpness, not at all.
Yes, and also it's the sharpness and also the depth. So the way this reflects light, as you can see here in the shadows and the highlights on this checkered board pattern, I mean, there's no way you can get that by stamping.
Now, are these new machines or are these old machines that they're using?
Some of them are new ones, I believe, and some of them are old ones. They're extremely difficult to find. I mean, so if you have a guillotine machine to sell, just reach out to Brigade, because I think they will give you a good price for it.
Why don't they just make more? I don't get it.
Yeah, I guess they could. I guess it's not impossible to make. I think they had a few new ones, and it's also it takes a long time to train people to do this. But I tried it myself actually, and it's one of the few things in watchmaking that I could see myself doing.
Being a guillocher.
Guillocher, yes, exactly.
What is there? What's the name for the person that operates a guillocher machine? There's got to be some fancy name.
It's guillocher.
Oh really?
Yes.
Guillocher.
Like a guillocher or something in English, but it's guillocher.
Guillocher. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so there's just a room of them. Like, are they standing during this process? Because people, when they hear machine, I don't think they realize like there is a machine, but there's also it's operated by hand. You can't just.
Yeah, it's a large machine. I mean, it weighs at least a few hundred pounds, and you have to be sitting. And what you're doing is with one hand you're driving a wheel that in turn rotates the piece that you're working on. So the dial itself is rotating, and with the other hand you're pressing a little cutting tool onto the surface of the piece that you're working on. And so you have to apply the correct amount of pressure to create these grooves and patterns, while with the other hand you're rotating it at the correct speed. And what happens is that the machine uses rosettes. These are basically oversized coins. They look like oversized coins with the edges having this pattern that's translated into this back and forth motion of the cutting tip that you're pressing onto the material, and that's how you end up with these grooves that are cut into the surface of the piece that you're working on. So it sounds complicated. When you look at the machine, it's an ingenious machine, and it's completely hand-driven, and you'll always have to determine where the pattern starts. So if you go back there onto the dial, you will see that every time when you end with a pattern, you will have to restart it from the other end, and you have to get the starting position exactly right and everything. And yeah, it's easy to get wrong. So yeah, that I found really impressive. I like that a lot.
Interesting. Okay, well, I look forward to seeing that article. I want to go see. I want to make some guilloche stuff myself.
Yeah, the article is another 5,500 words or something like that. It's done. It's finished. We will publish it sometime soon.
You know what's funny? I'm thinking like we write these articles so long it's like we could write a 1,000-word article or like and get the same quote unquote value out of it. It's not like more people read it because it's longer. I think what merits being said is like you and I and the other people on the team that write articles like this. We do so out of genuine passion for the topic because we really want to talk about it. Like, there's no marketing interest behind here, right? Like, we're not like no one's saying like, oh, we really need this article to be 5,000 words long.
At least 20 pages or 30 pages or something like that.
Yeah, like we're doing this because I mean, listen, if we had time, we'd write a lot more. But like, we still got to write a bunch of articles all the time. And I mean, I'm only saying this. People understand, like we're going and we're reporting on our direct experiences and things like that. And like, do we sometimes write articles about manufacturers of brands that advertise? Yes, but it's not like they're saying, let's sit down and talk about what we just literally go there and hang out and ask the questions we want and take our pictures. No one tells us anything really. Sometimes they have a tour where it's just like, here's a machine that does this. Here's a machine that does this. Like, we have to sit there and actually investigate as much as we can to bring the interesting stories. It's not like someone gives us like a bunch of pieces of paper and says like, here's all the important facts. And if they are giving us the important facts, they're never really important or interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So we do have to go there. we love going to these places, but we do have to go there, take all these pictures, ask all the right questions, and then sit down and write these crazy articles. And also, yeah, we are passionate about these things, but also, I guess we also enjoy creating articles that serve as a reference for a long, long time. I mean, the one on Breguet will discuss the history of Abraham-Louis Breguet and, the history of the company in a way that I couldn't find anywhere else. So when you read it through, you will understand where things are coming from and how how Breguet and the company itself ended up where it is right now. Or with the Casio G-Shock, I think that was insight that I've never ever seen something as detailed as that. So now that we have pat ourselves on the back a little bit, I guess we can say that here's for
hey, we deserve it.
Articles, yeah.
Pretty exactly. Podcasts on watches at 3 a.m.
Yeah, exactly. That's true.
Okay, everyone. Thanks for listening to this episode of Our Time, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you. Bye.